I'm just interested in how you got interested in psychology.
Well, Sully, I was always interested in everything, which is the brighter side of ADHD, which I'm sure that I've had my entire life. And it was particularly challenging as a child because they didn't have the diagnosis. The closest they got was something called minimal brain damage, MDB. And I was instructed to do things like sit on my hands and try to be still but I was interested in everything. But in the midst of having an interest in everything, I told my parents frustratedly at the age of 6 that I discovered my hobby and that it was collecting hobbies. And I did. I had a stamp collection, a rock collection, a coin collection, a leaf collection. I collected spiders in the wild and brought them so that I could study them in my yard. I collected dust beneath my bed. That was not a good one, but I was just interested in everything. And there was joy in learning. Having said that, I always also had a deep empathy for people. When I was in first grade, the third grade teacher brought her son who had cerebral palsy, who was my age, and he would sit in the first grade class while she taught. There wasn't a place for him to be at that point. And I was just naturally drawn to him and asked the teacher if I could sit with him. I was drawn towards those who were hurting or those who were suffering. As I grew and my interest grew and it expanded, very early on, I started drawing at the age of 4, and I did illustration, painting, some writing, all different kinds of things, physical activity. But by the time I was 13, I remember I performed my first piano solo at a concert at school and received a standing ovation. Wow. And I also performed Moonlight Sonata that day, but then I did my own composition, and that's what got the standing ovation. And after the concert, the music teacher said, "I want you to meet this gentleman." It was a bespectacled, gray-haired man who said, "Young man, I want you to keep practicing and playing because I want to see you in 4 or 5 years." And he was a Juilliard professor. And I already knew that there was no way I was going to be a pianist, because it seemed to me it was wonderful. I liked it, but it was very self-absorbed. And I just already had a sense, partly because I already had a live faith and a relationship with the Lord, that I was supposed to be helping people. And at the same time, that I loved science and learning. And so when I applied to college, I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. When I got to college, I said, well, it certainly seems that if I want to help people and I want to study science, you put those two together and it seems like it's psychology. So I jumped into a psychology major. But at Colgate University, where I was a college student, psychology was in the natural sciences division, not the social sciences division. So I studied rats and Y mazes and perception and cognition and learning and research and enjoyed that very much. But all the way along that line was also realizing that, even in high school and younger, people were drawn to tell me about their problems, et cetera, and so forth. And so it seemed like a logical direction to be going in. And I've perceived my entire life as a series of forks in the road. And you get there and you ask the Lord, which way should I go? And you talk to wiser, older Christians, and you read the scriptures and you pray and you make your best choice of which fork to go. And I have found that if you make the wrong choice, God doesn't smack you. He says, that's an excellent try, but I actually want you to go this way, and you redirect. And nothing is lost in that time because you grow from it. But by the time I was getting ready to leave college, I was quite sure that I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. And so that is when I applied for clinical psychology doctoral programs. And I applied to 6 of them and got in nowhere, which I believe was God's hand on my life, because I know that looking back, the year between beginning a doctoral program a year later, that year helped me reassess my life in multiple ways, which I believe helped give me a firmer foundation for when I started my studies.
What were one of those things that God wanted you to reevaluate, do you believe, before you went into that?
Well, we can start with the clinical psychology one, addiction. I had discovered that my drug of choice was coffee, and you may laugh at that, but I worked in a restaurant from 14 to 18, and then the summers too, and by the time I was 18, I stopped one day and counted, and I was drinking 10 or 12 cups of coffee a day. And boy, you can do anything when you drink that much caffeine. And it helps your ADHD. It helps you concentrate. It also makes you kind of obnoxious. By the time I was a senior in college, I had crept back up to 8 or 9 cups and said, if I'm going to go to graduate school where it's harder, I should stop this. So March 20, 1983, I took a jar of instant decaf and a jar of regular and mixed them half and half, and I would have that for emergencies, and I stopped drinking coffee, and it helped many things. But having a year off to have the time to form that discipline so that by the time I got to graduate school, coffee wasn't an issue. And obviously, I think lots of people can have a cup of coffee or 2 cups of coffee a day, and they're fine. I was not.
Yeah.
And so that's the physiological, psychological one. Another, I had someone very, very dear to me whose life was careening out of control, and if I had not been home that year, that person might have died. I also had experience with a prison ministry that I never would have had. But the special thing that year gave me, when I sat at home on the couch and watched kids walking to school, and I'd been a student for my whole life, and my advisor, by the way, had said, you're crazy not to think you'll get in, because I had very good credentials. And when I didn't get in, she said, I'm not surprised, it's very competitive. People have a way of rationalizing. But I really believe the Lord pulled me out that year, because I did have the credentials to get in. However, I remember saying, well, Lord, you know, I've had the first 22 years of my life. If you want one of the years of my life, who am I to complain about that? Well, my cultural heritage, not my bloodlines, but my cultural heritage is New York Jewish. My father was born in Brooklyn. His parents grew up in Brooklyn. And so when God talks to me, he talks with a bit of a Jewish accent and sometimes just smacks me in the back of the head a little bit. And God said, oh, you thought the first 22 were yours? Because you see, they had followed my script more closely. But that revelation, that understanding that no, my whole life had been God's. My whole life had been my Heavenly Father's. And this year was no different. Gave me an awareness of a deeper level of surrender to the one who made me and knows me best, and gave me a year to practice it. And I said to the Lord, like Gideon, my fleece was, look, I will apply again. If I don't get in a second time, I'm going to take that as evidence that you want me to do something else. And so I also started looking into other career possibilities, like teaching English in Micronesia. And I applied again, got into several places, and so started my graduate education. But the first thing I did when I started my graduate education that fall was go to Urbana and go to the Inter Cristo tables. That was a new organization. I'm not even sure if they're still around, but to see what are the jobs for psychologists who are Christians. And there weren't many. But I figured, well, you know, you're going to use me somehow, and I took those next steps by faith.